She says, I know we're going to have a happy marriage because we're going to enjoy all the blessings of a marriage, but I also know that we're going to have a happy marriage because we both have the blessings of an upbringing of love, that we have both come from a very loving home. And we see this in Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 1. And here it is, speaking directly to the shepherd. She says, "Oh, that you were like a brother to me, who nursed at my mother's breast." So what she's saying is that you grew up in a loving home just like I did. Your mother nursed you just like my mother nursed me. From the time that we were teeny tiny babies, our mothers began to teach us about love and how to express love. And I have observed, as I have been teaching these classes, that men and women who get married who come from good, loving homes, that they get married with a lot more skills on how to express love than couples who have grown up in homes where love has not been as obvious as it has in these others. So this is something that is important. This is something that the Shulammite recognizes. One guarantee we have, she says, of having a good marriage is that we both grew up in homes where we saw love expressed and where we felt love expressed. And so this is something that is very important. So this is something that the Shulammite recognizes this, and it's something that we need to recognize too. If we're about to get married, then one thing we need to do is we need to look at that young man's family in his home. We need to look at our own family in our own home, and we need to ask some questions. Be good to ask that young man, did you grow up and when you were growing up, did you ever see your mother and dad kiss? Did you ever see your mother and dad tell each other that they loved each other? Did your mother and dad ever tell you that they loved each other? Better than that, can you tell your parents that you love them? And what about how did you get along with your brothers and sisters? Did you get along with your brothers and sisters, or did you just fuss and fight all the time? Now, psychologists have discovered in polling marriages that where people were getting divorces and marriages were breaking up, and then in polling successful marriages and finding out what the home life was like prior to the marriage, the original home life, they have found that in the majority of marriages breaking up and getting divorces, that they have gone back and found that those couples in their home, that there was a lot of sibling rivalry and fights, that they did not know how to get along with their brothers and sisters, and they carried this lack of skills on into their marriage and did not learn how to get along with their marriage partner. In the marriages that stayed together, they found that in the majority of these marriages that these people had come from good homes, that they had come from homes where they could get along with their brothers and sisters and where they had developed some communication skills. And so this is something that is extremely important, is to look at to see what kind of a home he came from. How does he get along with his brothers and sisters? Because if he grew up in a home where he never saw his mother and dad express affection for each other, or he fought with his brothers and sisters all the time, then I'm not saying don't marry him. I'm saying expect problems and start to deal with those problems before you get married. Because learning to love is something that we can do. If we're motivated, if we want to learn how to love, then we can learn how to do that. So young couples need to talk about that ahead of time. No, I didn't learn how to love in my home. No, I never saw my mother and dad love each other. No, my mom and dad don't come up and pat me or hug me or kiss me. I'm awkward about expressing physical affection, but I don't want to be that way. I want to learn how to express love and to start to learn how to express love before marriage, to start to work on these things and to have it out into the open. Because if we bring it up after marriage, then a lot of times it's going to cause problems and it's going to cause resentments, and a lot of times there is not the motivation there to learn how to change these behaviors, because this is something that is extremely important. In fact, this is so important and that I'm going to give you another one of my famous guarantees. And this guarantee is that I guarantee that if you fail to examine his home before marriage, then I guarantee that you will examine it after marriage, and then when problems arise, and then it will probably lead to bitterness. Now, the reason I feel so confident in giving this guarantee is that over the years when I have talked to women, doesn't matter how old they were, whether they were young or old, and they start to talk to me about their problems, guess where they always begin? When he was a little boy. When he was a little boy, his mama did this. When he was a little boy, his dad did this. When he was a little boy, he just fought and fussed with his brothers and sisters all the time. In fact, they still fuss and fight with each other. When he was a little boy, his mama just pampered him, and he was a mama's baby, and he's still a mama's baby. And so I have heard this so many times that I'm confident that this is just part of being a woman. Part of the way we're different than men is that we have the ability to draw analogies that men don't have. And when problems arise, it is just natural for a woman to look back at his home life and to see if we can see the beginning of this problem in his home. And so this is something that women do. But if we do it after marriage, if we start examining his home after marriage, then it leads to problems. If we look at his home and we see problems, then many times it causes in-law problems. It causes resentment towards his parents because they didn't do a better job of raising him, and now we have to put up with all the mistakes that they've made. If we bring it up to our husband, well, you're this way because you're a mama's baby and your mother pampered you all the time, or your dad did this and this is the way why you're this way, then it creates resentment and bitterness on the man's part. He's not drawing analogies the way we are. This isn't going to be as logical to him as it is to us. And he's going to say, well, what does that have to do with anything? That was then, this is now, and why are we trying to do this now? Why are you picking on my parents? So it's going to cause resentment and bitterness towards the husband. So the time to examine the home is before you get married, and to talk about it with him then, because then he's going to be receptive. Then he's going to be more willing to learn how to conquer some of these problems. Now, I gave you a handout about Charles and Di, and I'm not going to take time to read that all to you now. That's why I gave you the handout, so you can read that. But we are continually seeing newspaper and magazine articles about Charles and Di and all the marriage problems that they're having. This has just been going on almost from the time that they were married. And this magazine article here talks about, up here at the beginning, it says Charles and Di, the past that haunts them. It says most experts agree that the kind of marriage a couple creates is strongly influenced by the marriages both partners observed as children. And then it goes on to talk about all of their past history, about all of the divorces, about all of the affairs that both of them have had in their background. And when you read this, you see that there really aren't any good examples for them to have learned from. Charles is a descendant of Queen Victoria, who ushered in Victorian morals. The royal family is known for its coldness. And so it's no wonder that they have the problems that they do. And so this is just something for you to read and to help you appreciate the value of examining the home and how important this is. Okay, then the Shulammite comes back and tells him about one more blessing. That we've got the blessings of coming from loving homes. We've got the blessings of marriage. And then she says we're going to have the blessing in our marriage of displaying affection. And we see this in Song of Solomon, chapter 8, the second part of verse 1. She says, if I found you outdoors, I would kiss you, and no one would despise me either. So she's saying, let's get married, and if I find you outdoors, then I'm just going to impulsively kiss you, show affection for you, and no one is going to despise me because we're married. I have a legal right to do this. So again, as we talked a little bit earlier, she's going to be the initiator of love. Contrary to Victorian morals that say this is the man's job, the Shulammite, long before Victorian morals ever came into being popular, she said, this is what I am going to do. I'm always hearing women say, oh, I would just give anything if my husband would just come up and hug me or pat me or squeeze me. I'd just give anything if he'd do these things. Yet the Bible pictures the woman as the one to do this, as the one to go up and to pat and to hug and to squeeze her husband to show affection. She is the one that sets the stage. You know, a lot of times when husbands and wives have company come and stay for several days, after a few days the husband begins to get very grouchy and irritable, and the company begins to feel like they've overstayed their welcome, and the wife is starting to get embarrassed because he's so obviously grouchy and irritable, and she doesn't know what to do with him. Well, I think the reason that husbands get grouchy and irritable when company comes to stay is because here's this wife running around cooking all of these gourmet meals, doing all of these things, cleaning house and doing all these things, trying to impress her company and doing things for them, that she leaves her husband out. She doesn't have enough time to do all the little loving acts that she normally does for him. And after a few days, that husband is love-starved. He's grouchy and irritable because he hasn't been getting his normal dose of love, and he's not reacting very well to it. So if we want to have company and have a happy husband at the same time, then what we need to do is we need to take care of him along with our company. You know, while we're serving our company, there's nothing wrong with serving our husband first. After all, he's the one in 10,000 to us. He's the one that went out and earned the money so that we can put this food on the table. And, you know, our husbands notice that. We may not think they do, but they notice that. Our guests notice that, and that's something that is good for them to notice, that we're placing our husband first, that we're serving him in this way. There's nothing wrong as we serve him there at the table in front of our guests to pat him on the back or to give him a squeeze or even to give him a peck on the cheek to show him some kind of affection. It's good for our company to see this. It's good for our children to see this. And if we will give him this display of affection, then we're going to be feeding his need for love, and we're going to be preventing him from getting grouchy and irritable and from embarrassing us in front of our company. So this is something that is important, that we need to take care of our husband's needs and display affection in this way. Several years ago, my grandmother gave her older sister some advice in this area that I think would be good to repeat. Several years ago, we had a family reunion, and all the women were in one room sitting around a table eating together, and all the men were in another room sitting around the table eating together. So we kind of had our own private area and could have our own private conversation. I had a great aunt who was there, who's my grandmother's older sister, and this great aunt was somewhere up in her 70s. And this great aunt had grown up in a real small town of about 300 to 400 people. And after her husband retired, they had moved back to this same town, and she had lived there for the rest of her life. So my aunt had married a man, and then when she moved back to this town, well, then he died after he retired. So then what she did was she married another man in that community that she had known ever since she was a young girl. And this second man that she married, he told her that he had loved her back before either one of them had ever gotten married. But he had simply been too bashful to say anything to her, so she had married this other fellow and moved off. So he had gotten married also. His wife had died prior to my aunt's first husband dying, so they got together and they got married. And they enjoyed many years together before he died of cancer. Then my aunt married a third time. The third man she married, she had also known in the same community, had grown up knowing him all of her life. But the third man had never married. He had been a bachelor for 65 or 70 years of his life. And so this aunt married this man. And he was the man that she was married to during this conversation at the dinner table. So this aunt began to gripe about her third husband, about how that he wasn't very affectionate and wasn't good at expressing affection and telling her that he loved her. And she says, you know, when I was married to the second man, she said, there wasn't a day go by when he didn't tell me that he loved me. There wasn't a day go by that he didn't show affection towards me. And she says, I just miss that so much, and I'm not getting that now in my third marriage. And my grandmother gave her some advice that I think was very good. My grandmother said, she says, the difference between these two husbands is that your second husband had a wife before he had you. He had a wife to teach him how to love a woman. He had a wife to teach him what a woman's emotional needs are and how to care for a woman. But your third husband, he's never had a wife. He's never had a woman to teach him about a woman's needs and to teach him what it is that you need. So you have got to take on that job. You have got to teach him how to love you. And this is something that I have found is true. You know, men are different. They're not as emotional as we are. They don't have the same needs that we have. And so we have got to teach our husbands how to love. We've got to teach them about our emotional needs. And this is what the Shulammite is saying. I'm going to be the initiator of love. I'm going to be the one who teaches you these things and these qualities. I'm going to set the stage and set the atmosphere for you to respond to. So if we'll realize that this is our job to teach our husbands about women, then our husbands are going to respond, and we're going to have the type of love relationship that we want. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Okay, as we continue in the Song of Solomon, she's been talking about the blessings that she knows they're going to have. They're coming from a loving home. They're going to have the blessings of affection expressed. And then we're going to see another blessing that she's going to have, that she's telling him that she has, and that is the blessings of a loving mother. And that she has the blessings of a loving mother because her mother has protected her. In Song of Solomon, chapter 8, verse 2, she says, I would lead you and bring you into the house of my mother who used to instruct me. This word instruct is kind of a strong word that carries with it the idea of discipline. So her mother didn't just tell her these things, but her mother helped her learn these things. So all the things that I've learned that have helped protect me from Solomon, I owe all of this to my mother, is the one who instructed me. And let's turn over to Proverbs 22, verse 3, and notice just a general principle of protection and how that is that we can be protected. In Proverbs 22, verse 3, here it is, it says, the prudent, we're talking about the wise, sees the evil and hides himself, but the naive go on and are punished for it. So if we're going to be wise, we're going to look around and we're going to see evil around us and we're going to hide ourselves from the evil. But if we're naive, then we're just going to go ahead and jump into situations and we're going to suffer punishment for it. So what I want us to do is I want us to talk about some ways that mothers can protect their daughters from an evil that we see in society today. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about sweetheart murders and date rape and how it is that mothers can help protect their daughters in this area. In the area of sweetheart murders, I have an article here I want to read you a few excerpts from. It says, Sweetheart murders, when teen boyfriends turn into killers. Jennifer Crompton was 14 years old, a pretty blonde honor student when she met 18-year-old Mark. They dated for a year, mostly seeing each other at school or at her home. She had only 2 real dates with him, and I drove them, says Jennifer's mother. He was shy but charming. Jennifer's parents didn't know that Mark was also possessive and jealous, continually pressuring Jennifer for sex and sometimes even slapping or shoving her. And they didn't know that after Jennifer decided not to see him again, Mark began sending her threatening notes. One afternoon, Mark broke into the Compton home and stabbed Jennifer 63 times. There are hundreds of sweetheart murders each year, and then this asks the question, can they be prevented? And so I want us to talk just a little bit about how it is that mothers can help prevent this. First of all, it says, signs of danger. How then can parents recognize if their daughters are at risk? While it's not always possible to predict danger, experts agree that there are certain characteristics and behavior patterns of the obsessive boyfriend that can be noticed by alert parents and their daughters before a tragedy occurs. First, he is overly possessive, extremely jealous, and calls to check up on her several times a day. He often seems to lack his own interests and goals and is overly dependent on the relationship, insisting on becoming more and more involved. He may even follow her around. He discourages her own outside interests and friendships and attempts to isolate her from family and friends. He decides what they will do and when. He has a need for total control. He has preset ideas about their future together, which she may not be in agreement with. He has poor communication skills and refuses or is unable to settle differences with words. His violence increases with the use of alcohol or drugs. What can parents do? If your daughter is already in a relationship you believe is unhealthy, there are ways to confront her about it without threatening or alienating her. It's important, however, for you to avoid criticizing the boy's appearance, manner, or lack of goals. If you express disapproval of him on these grounds, the girl will be less likely to reveal anything to you. They suggest that a parent begin a conversation by saying, "I feel a little uneasy about this relationship, although I can't pinpoint exactly what it is." You could then ask her if she loves the boy, and if so, what she loves about him. If she says nothing that would indicate that there is anything amiss in the relationship, you may have to ask direct questions. Is he too possessive? Does he value your opinion? Does he get jealous easily? Does he have a violent temper? By opening communication with your daughter, you are making her aware of the kinds of behavior that are not acceptable or normal in a healthy relationship. Then it says, most important, warn her to take any threats he makes, either directly to her or to friends, seriously. Insist that she share them with you. Keep a detailed record of any incidents of harassment or threats made. If there are witnesses, attempt to get notarized statements from them. Any incidents occurring at school should be reported to school officials. And then it says, before your child ever has her first date, she should be instructed on what is proper and improper dating behavior. She should learn that there are boys out there who want to control their girlfriends and why that's wrong. Teach your daughter that no boyfriend has the right to dictate to her where she can and can't be. Call her several times a day in order to check up on her. Follow her around. Keep her away from her friends or participate in all her activities. If he has a violent temper, she mustn't think that she can change his behavior. Most importantly, she must learn that he has no right to strike her, ever. That she never deserves physical abuse, no matter what she's done, even if she's been unfaithful as far as their relationship is concerned. She must say at the outset, with the first shove or slap, "If you ever touch me again, we're finished." Chances are he won't want to continue seeing a girl who is assertive and means what she says. So this is something that mothers need to discuss with their daughters and to help protect their daughters from getting in a relationship that may end up in harm. In the area of date rape, here's an article that talks about it. It says, victims of stranger rape may be as young as 2 and as old as 92, but the most common prey of date rapists are young women between 15 and 25. A young single woman is far more likely to be raped on a date than in a dark alley. And says 1 out of 8 women that were polled at a Midwestern campus had been raped, and 75% knew the men who assaulted them. So here it is, it says out of the women that were polled at this school that 1 out of 8 of the women had been raped, and 75% of them are what we would call date rapes because they knew the man who had done this. Then it says that sexually assaultive males lack empathy, social conscience, and maturity. They view women as adversaries and believe force is a legitimate way to get what they want. Other researchers have found that date rapists rarely feel guilty and often insist they have done nothing wrong. A typical example is the 21-year-old history major who raped a freshman at Wellesley College. When she confronted him later, he said men sometimes lose control. He knew he'd forced me and hurt me, she says, but he didn't care. He simply said men have powerful sexual urges that she didn't understand. Okay, then it says that date rape is seldom an isolated incident. It says a woman may think she's the only one, but when she finally talks to her friends, she may learn that the same man has raped other women. And says campus police sometimes find numerous complaints have been filed against the same guy. Okay, some of their recommendations on how to avoid date rape is number 1 is be assertive. They said the date rapist tests the water before he makes his move, so it helps to set clear limits. If you don't like a man's behavior, send a clear, forceful message. I feel uncomfortable when you put your hand on my knee. Please stop. Be prepared to withstand pressure and to follow words with actions, such as leaving immediately. It says, remember, you have the right to refuse requests without explaining, to express discomfort, to change your mind, and to ask others to adjust behavior that is bothering you. Okay, the second recommendation is trust your instincts. It says, many victims of date rape report that they began to have misgivings but ignored them. When I refused to invite my date in for coffee, one woman remembers, he said I was uptight and paranoid. I didn't like him at all, but I wanted to prove I wasn't uptight, so I finally asked him in. In another case, a college student was asked to accompany her date to her room while he looked for his scarf. I just met him and felt uneasy, but I didn't want to make a big deal of it, so I went, she said. If these women had trusted their instincts and stood their ground, 2 rapes might have been prevented. When you feel uneasy, pay attention. If you feel threatened, get out of the situation immediately. Forget your embarrassment and your manners. Always carry enough money for a taxi ride home. Last night, after we went over this in class, I had a lady come up and talk to me after class, and she said that she, after listening to this, she had realized, and she'd realized before, that she had nearly been a victim of date rape when she was in her early 20s. And so she told me about the incident and said that the fellow was a Christian boy, and she said that because he was a Christian, she kind of didn't fully trust her instincts, but said just because somebody is a Christian doesn't mean you're safe. She said she had a date with this fellow, and he invited her to come home with him to his apartment, and said he had traveled around the world and had lots of souvenirs for he wanted to show her. And she said she felt uneasy about it, but she thought, well, this is a Christian, this should be safe. So she went with him. She said he took her into his apartment, started showing her all around all these things. Of course, the last room he showed her was his bedroom. He had her sit down on the bed while he showed her things. And she said she was immediately getting very nervous and wondering about what in the world am I going to do. She said he kissed her then, and she said she just started shaking and said, you take me home right now, and just insisted that he take her home. Well, he did. He took her home. She said she realizes that she's really very fortunate. And then she said he called her for 2 weeks, and she refused to ever see him again. And for 2 weeks, he spent on the phone trying to convince her that fornication was not a sin. And his argument was that adultery is a sin. As long as you're not married, then you can do whatever you want. And he says 90% of the Christian girls that I approach have sex with me, and there's no reason why you shouldn't, and this sort of thing. And so she realized, especially later, what it was he did have in mind, and that she was very fortunate. So this is something that we need to protect our daughters from. She said when she told her mother about the incident, that her mother said, well, I wondered about him. She said, I had some uneasy feelings about him. And she says, Mother, why in the world didn't you tell me about that this could have turned into something really bad? So mothers do need to help protect their daughters. They need to talk about these things. And, of course, the time to talk about them is before the daughter starts dating and gets in some situations, so that she doesn't feel like mother is just picking on my boyfriend, and so that she can view it in a more logical viewpoint. So the Shulamite's mother, she protected her. She taught her some things, especially about love, that we have seen all the way through the Song of Solomon, that she has a real good understanding about the sexual relationship and about marriage and about love. Something else that her mother taught her is about food. And we know that her mother taught her about food because in Ecclesiastes, or not in Ecclesiastes, but in the Song of Solomon, at the end of chapter 2, not the end of chapter 2, at the end of verse 2, chapter 8, verse 2, she says, I would give you spiced wine to drink from the juice of my pomegranates. So she's saying, come on, let's get married, let's go home. I'm going to bring you home to Mother, who used to instruct me. Mother used to teach me things. And I'm going to give you something good and cold to drink, something refreshing. So she understands the importance of food to men. And all of these verses in Ecclesiastes, when you read Ecclesiastes, it's talking about a man's reward for working on earth. All of these verses in Ecclesiastes are saying essentially the same thing. And we're going to look up just the first one. And this is not in your book. So if you want this information about food, you're going to have to take these verses down. But these verses are all essentially saying the same. We'll read the first one, and then you can read the others at home. In Ecclesiastes 2, verses 22 through 24, then again in chapter 3, verse 13, chapter 5, verse 18, and chapter 8, verse 15, and then chapter 9, verse 7. So let's look at the one in chapter 2, verses 22 through 24. It says, "For what does a man get in all of his labor and in his striving with which he labors under the sun?" So what is a man's reward for going to work day after day? Verse 23, it says, "Because all his days his task is painful and grievous. Even at night his mind does not rest. This too is vanity. There is nothing better for a man than to eat and drink and to tell himself that his labor is good." So what's a man's reward? Is to enjoy putting food on the table and to feel good about what he's doing, what he's accomplishing. It says, "This also I have seen, that this is from the hand of God." So God is the one that makes men this way, where they have this appreciation of food. Food is something that is very important to men. One time after I had talked about how important food was in a class, I had a lady come up after class and tell me, she says, "You know, I have never thought about this before, but as I look back on it, I can realize that every time that I have just put the food on the table in the pots and pans, that after dinner my husband has gotten up from the table and gone in and watched television and not paid any attention to me all the rest of the evening. But she says, you know, on the times when I take the time to put the food in bowls and to set the table nicely, that my husband, after he gets up from eating, he is so affectionate and he gives me all kinds of attention." And she says, "I have never made the connection with the way I set the table, that he is affected by the way I set the table." Now, I'm sure this husband doesn't deliberately think, well, she just put the food on the table in pots and pans, so I'm going to ignore her this evening. I'm sure that this is something that's just an automatic reaction to his part. He notices when she goes to this extra trouble, and it's something that he really appreciates. I had another woman in my class one time that after we kind of studied about the importance of food, said she went home and she fixed a real gourmet dinner for her husband. And it was something that she had to just spend several hours preparing it, and then it had a long time to cook in the oven. And her husband knew what she was doing. He knew she was in there fixing this gourmet dinner for him. And she said they lived in an apartment house, and so while the food was in the oven cooking, he went next door and got his friend next door, brought him home, opened the oven door, and said, Look at what my wife is doing for me. And he was really impressed that she cared this much about him. So food is something that is really very important to a man. Now the Shulammite tells the shepherd, "I'm going to give you a drink when I bring you home to mother." And the feminists, they come along and they see women bringing their husbands cold drinks and doing nice things for them in this way. And they say, "He's got 2 arms. He's got 2 legs. He can do it for himself. He doesn't need me to do these things." Well, you know, it is exactly because a man does have 2 arms and because he does have 2 legs that when we go to the extra trouble to wait on him and to do these little special things for him, that this is an act of love for him. So a couple of years ago when I was on crutches for a couple of weeks, I really thought about this passage and appreciated the significance of this being an act of love. When I was on crutches, I couldn't even go get a drink of water for myself. Now, I could go to the sink and sit there or stand there and drink it, but I couldn't carry that glass to a chair or to a table. If I wanted something to drink, I had to get my husband or my children to go get me a drink. I was totally dependent upon them. And I always felt like I was imposing. I always felt bad about that. And even though I discussed this with my husband and he told me, "I'm glad to do these things for you. I'm even enjoying taking our daughter and going grocery shopping. I'm even enjoying doing these things. I'm glad I can do these things." Even though he reassured me continually that he felt good about it, I continued to feel like I was imposing upon him and then reluctantly would ask him to do these things for me. But do you know when he goes and does something for me that he doesn't have to do for me, that he just does it because he wants to, then that is really, to me, in my way of thinking, a tremendous act of love. That's something I enjoy and I really appreciate. Our husbands know they've got 2 arms. They know they've got 2 legs. They know they can do these things for them, or that they can do these things for themselves. And they know that when we do it and volunteer to do it, then this is something that is an act of love and that they appreciate and that they notice. Food is something that is very important to a man. And this is something that we can notice also in feminist marriages. I have a cartoon up here. Here's the preacher burying the young couple, and as part of the vows is, he says, "Now then, who is responsible for what chores?" Of course, this is a cartoon, but this is the way it is in many modern marriages. Before people get married, they have marriage contracts. They figure out exactly who is going to do what. There are a lot of books out on the market today talking about feminist marriages and how some of these things work out in their marriages. Now, the word feminist does not mean a woman. A feminist can be either a man or a woman. It simply means someone who holds no distinction between men and women. So you have feminist men and you have feminist women. And so what we have, especially since Betty Friedan has come along, and there's a lot of teaching in the schools today too to help boys be more understanding of women. And there are many young men, young husbands, and some older ones too, especially since the feminist movement has been here, who are very supportive of the feminist movement. And I'm going to read you an excerpt or a summary of a book that is dealing with these feminist type marriages, where you have a feminist woman very carefully choosing a feminist husband, a man who before they ever get married, they agree to split all the jobs down the middle. They split the house cleaning jobs, they split the cooking, they split the shopping, they split the laundry, they split taking care of the children. This is agreed upon. It is not something that the husband reluctantly agrees on. It is a philosophy that he believes in. He supports his wife totally in her career, and he is willing to share the jobs 100%. This summary is from the book called Successful Women, Angry Men, and it is by BeBe Campbell, who is a feminist. And she's talking about, she has looked at many feminist marriages who have tried to pick out the ideal mate, and she is seeing all these feminist marriages ending up 10 and 20 years later in divorce. And she is trying to figure out why it is all these feminist marriages are ending in divorce. I think this woman has a good insight into what is wrong with these marriages, but she has no solution for the feminists. Now, she talks about how that one of the number one problems in these marriages is the woman overworking in her job. It says there's overwork at the office, and as they're trying to climb the corporate ladders, there's lots of social events and political events that they have to be involved in order to really make their career soar and to be able to make the kind of money that they want. And they say that these men who originally supported their women in their jobs and in their career choices, that these feminist men need admiration and they need companionship. So these feminist women, when they married these feminist men, they had this same charm that we've been talking about all along in Proverbs 31. Feminist men will not marry a feminist woman if she does not admire them and express that admiration in courtship. So this is part of what created this marriage in the first place, and she recognizes that these men need it. But once the woman begins to overwork, and especially when children come along and the workload even increases, then these husbands stop getting the admiration that they need, and problems start to happen. Then there are also problems, lots of sexual problems in these marriages, simply because the women are too tired and too preoccupied to be available for their husbands. And she says that these men, they need admiration and they need this sexual companionship. And after several years of not getting it, it says these men react with anger and excessive criticism of their wives. And she calls it backlash. This is a word that you're going to see in feminist literature, is a backlash that comes from these feminist men. And so in her book, when you read it, you find out that she doesn't understand the purpose of life as it's expressed in Ecclesiastes, and doesn't understand basically these are basic needs of men. She recognizes it, but she doesn't recognize that the feminists need to keep giving it to them. And then, even though these men have agreed to do half of the grocery shopping and half of the cooking, over the years, food becomes increasingly important to these men. That their wives would cook and fix meals for them is increasingly important to these men, and it is something that becomes a point to argue about and a point of contention in these marriages. So this verse in Ecclesiastes says that one thing God has given men as their reward for working in life, whether they are a average husband who wants to be the breadwinner, or whether they are a feminist man who wants his wife to go out and work, is food. Food is part of man's reward, and it is there regardless of their marriage. And so that this is something that is very important. So why do feminist marriages fail? Is because they do not make commitment to continue to do the things that the Shulammite is doing. He's 1 in 10,000. She's got this admiration for him. She's going to be like the woman of great price. She's going to give it to him all of their marriage. She is going to satisfy his needs for food. So this is something that is important and something we can look out and see in the world today. Then the Shulammite, as she's continuing to talk to the shepherd, she talks to him about the blessings of sexual love. In chapter 8, verse 3, she says, "Let his left hand be under my head, and his right hand embrace me." So she's got an attitude of looking forward towards the sexual relationship. All the way through the Song of Solomon, we've been seeing that she has a very healthy attitude towards this relationship. So let's get married. Let's go ahead and enjoy this relationship. I'm ready to be all that you want me to be in this relationship. So we're going to have a happy marriage because we're going to have the blessings of a good sexual relationship. Then she comes back and she's going to speak to the maidens again for the very last time. This is the third time that she gives the theme of the Song of Solomon. And she says, "I want you to swear," and this is the 7 times, "or pledge yourself, O daughters of Jerusalem. Do not arouse or awaken my love until she or it pleases." She's telling these maidens, can't you see what has nearly happened? I nearly married King Solomon when I didn't love him. I nearly spent my whole life without love, and I just nearly made this terrible mistake. Can't you learn from this? Learn that love is something you don't force. You have to have this emotional involvement. You have to have this commitment and let love grow naturally. Now this is the last that we see of these maidens. And so she and the shepherd, they're going to leave and they're going to go out into the country. But I have down here kind of as a summary of the sexual relationship is that verbal sexual communication, not sexual experimentation, assures a couple of a wonderfully ecstatic relationship of rapture in each other's arms until death do they part. If we want to have a wonderful and successful relationship, then what we need to do in courtship is we need to have some verbal sexual communication. Instead of experimenting with sex, talk about it. Find out what kind of home he grew up in. Did he see his parents express affection? If he didn't, he's going to have some problems. Let's talk about it. Talk about the Bible's meaning of this relationship and learn how to use it in a proper way. And then having purity, then this is the way to have success rather than experimenting and trying to find just the magic combination of bodies. Then this is the way we're going to have success. Okay, then where we are right now, we have finished scene number 2. She's going to leave this big room. We're no longer going to see the maidens again. They're left out of the picture. Then in chapter 8, verse 5, then this is going to begin scene number 3. And she says, and what chapter 5 is, this is the chorus of the country people speaking. The country people say, "Who is this coming up from the wilderness, leaning on her beloved?" So we know what has happened just by what the country people say. And the country people are seeing the Shulammite and the shepherd walking through the country, coming towards them, and they're saying, "Who is this coming up from the wilderness?" Now this is the same group of people that watched her go to Solomon's palace in his caravan. So they are very curious. They are wanting to know what is going on. Here it is, she is coming back, and she is coming back with the shepherd. She left with Solomon, and she comes back with the shepherd. Next week we're going to get into their actual wedding ceremony, and these country people are going to come back and ask her a riddle about this because it is something that they are very curious about. So next week we're going to start with scene 3 in chapter 8, verse 5. So we're going to stop there for today. And next week we will finish the Song of Solomon. Now, in your assignment, to give you your assignments, you're to read volume 1, pages 376 through 392, which is just reading about the Song of Solomon. And then do the study and problem-solving exercises in Volume 1 on pages 405 through 407. Then in Volume 2, I want you to read The Victims of Victorian Morals, Chapter 3. I think you'll have a lot of fun reading that chapter. That's a chapter, I probably had more fun writing that chapter in Volume 2 than any of the other chapters, just because of all of the ridiculous things that the Victorians taught and thought. And a lot of that, if we can see where some of the things, attitudes that we have today, if we can see where it came from, see how ridiculous it is, then I think it's easier for us to let go of it and to realize it's not worthy of us to keep in our minds. And then read Chapter 2, or in Volume 2, Chapter 13, The Secret of One Flesh, that we went over today. So that's going to be your assignment for this week.